Welcome to another video where I talk about the history and mythology behind anime. In the last episode of To Your Eternity, we see a village of tribal people who are being forced to sacrifice a girl to a god named Oniguma, a being who grants peace and prosperity to their region. It is tradition that untainted women be selected for this tribute, which in this case means that they're virgin women, leaving the option down to 2 young children and an infant. The girl selected was named March, and to ensure that she stays pure, no men were allowed near her, not even her father. The plan for her sacrifice was to have this big feast in her village, then walk her up a mountain for 3 days with a group of soldiers to protect her, and there they would set up an altar for her to sleep on. The soldiers would leave before Oniguma showed up, and they would return a year later to collect whatever remained of her body. This kind of idea is honestly fairly common when we talk about shonen or adventure anime as well. If we look at One Piece's Skypiea arc, we can see flashbacks of Mont Blanc Nolan as he arrives on Jaya and finds this girl on an altar about to be sacrificed to a giant snake named Kashigami, who the village believed to be a god. They also believed that their land had been cursed, the crops were dying, their people were sick, but if they were to sacrifice someone to this snake god, they might be granted safety and a cure. More specifically, they had to sacrifice the most beautiful woman in the village. Of course, Nolan shows up, stops the sacrifice, and eventually cures the disease using medicine instead. Finally, I wanted to talk about Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, in which human sacrifice plays a massive role in the character history of both Father and Hohenheim. Hohenheim in his youth was a slave in a city called Xerxes. Using him as a base, the city produced a homunculus named the Dwarf in the Flask. The dwarf was a reflection of what was beyond the Gate of Truth, and the homunculus would give guidance to the king who was looking to attain immortality. The king was told that if he created what was essentially a nationwide transmutation circle and sacrificed all of the people in his kingdom, he would be given this immortality. However, he was lied to. The dwarf fooled him, and he ended up being sacrificed himself, leaving Hohenheim and the dwarf to become living philosopher's stones and effectively immortal. Now, these are only a few examples of human sacrifice being used in anime out of dozens and dozens of examples. And you might notice a few things here. Firstly, in almost every case of human sacrifice in anime, it tends to be some kind of religious or god-based reason. Oniguma, Kashigami, and truth, for example. However, the first two definitely have a different feeling to them than the final example. In each case, a member of the community was being sacrificed for the good of the rest of the community, a group was losing a part of itself to protect the rest, and it's done in some sort of selfless way in terms of that person being sacrificed to protect their own people. And at the same time, we often see the other people in those tribes in pain at the idea of losing their friends or family members. However, in the case of Fullmetal Alchemist, we have a selfish wish. The king isn't trying to protect his people, he's actually willing to give them up to ensure his own immortality. As such, we see his people being slaughtered and lied to. It's an event filled with deceit and brutality, and while none of these examples are painted in a particularly positive light, this one is treated as an atrocity. And obviously this isn't just in anime, but where exactly does the idea of human sacrifice come from? Why is there this trend for using virgin girls, and how often is that sort of thing happening in the real world? So today I want to talk about some cliches or tropes of human sacrifice in entertainment, where those come from, and then talk about some examples of that happening in our world just to give you guys some interesting history on the subject. The first thing that we should really take a look at is the why behind human sacrifices. And I think that typically entertainment does a pretty good job at describing this. Plenty of the places that practice this sort of ritual tend to have a very theistic view of the world, be they believing in one all-powerful god, for example the Christian God asking the sacrifice of Abraham's son to prove his devotion to God, or to many smaller ones. As a result, many times it ends up being used as a way to appease the gods, as a show of asking for forgiveness, for personal blessings, or for divine assistance with crops or hunting. And that all lines up when you consider the types of deities that people tend to sacrifice for. I feel like the most cliché would be the ones being sacrificed to volcano or mountain gods, obviously a way to make peace with those deities so that they might not go off and kill everyone living nearby. Similarly, river, ocean, and storm deities might have sacrifices devoted to them as well. This might be a plea for rain, plentiful fishing, safe voyage, avoiding floods, Things like that. It's something that these people might have been able to do to at least give them peace of mind when living in dangerous areas. They are a show of devotion to demonstrate their dedication to a deity in hopes that they might be rewarded. But that doesn't explain why there's this trope of virgins. And most likely the idea of virgins being used comes from this idea of them being untainted or pure, a theme showing up in plenty of religions as well, and most times it's just seen as them offering the best or cleanest possible gift to the gods. And while it isn't a hard requirement of human sacrifices for the sacrificed person to be a virgin in most cases, there are a few specific famous examples where it is. And honestly, I think it's the marketability of these situations when used in entertainment that made them such a popular trope. What would be able to draw more people in than just the story of human sacrifice? Well, what about virgin sacrifice? It's basically just the YouTube thumbnail version of human sacrifices when it comes to entertainment. One of the most famous examples, and the one that's most likely to be the inspiration behind virgins being used for sacrifices in entertainment, would likely be the Maya. And just in general, South American sacrifices make up for a lot of tropes in media, so we will be talking about a few of them here. But anyways, at the Mayan pyramid of Chichen Itza, there's a sacred well, the cenote. While prisoners of war were often sacrificed here, the part which is relevant is, of course, the virgin sacrifices. Some Mayan girls in early childhood would be raised with the goal of making them as physically perfect as possible so they could undergo spiritual training, and in their later teens or in their early 20s, they would be sacrificed for the good of their people. The evidence based on the bodies suggests that the women were killed fairly brutally, and of the 53 skeletons found at this site, all but 8 were women. They were all buried meters away from a burial site of 2 men who seemed to be the elders, possibly leaders for their community. While we're on the topic of the Mayans though, we also have their famous ball game, which you might have seen in the Road to El Dorado movie. While the jury is still out whether people were actually sacrificed for this game or not, many scholars do believe that they would show devotion by playing this game and the losing team would be sacrificed at the end to show devotion to their gods. Now back to the idea of virgins though, this can also be seen in the Incan society. However, there are some small differences. Primarily, the Inca tended to develop young children for the purpose of sacrificing much more regularly than the Mayans, and this would be out of the feeling of necessity. Their culture was one which was plagued by natural disasters such as volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, or flooding. Much like the Maya, the Inca would sacrifice children, again, trying to develop them into the healthiest bodies possible to ensure the highest quality sacrifice for the gods, all in hopes of gaining their favor and their protection. That said, they also believed in an afterlife where these children could remain happy for eternity. Now, if we're already talking about South American cultures, we might as well bring up the most famous of them when it comes to human sacrifice, the Aztecs. Many people believe that the idea of Aztecs sacrificing people probably came from Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador who wrote about witnessing an Aztec priest using obsidian blades to slice open a person's chest, then removing their still-beating heart and offering it to the gods, all before throwing their bodies down the steps of Templo Mayor. All of this was made even more graphic when you add in the account of another conquistador, Andrés de Tapia. He mentioned having 2 massive towers on either side of Templo Mayor that were made entirely of human skulls, and for some time this was considered to be a massive exaggeration used to justify the killing of an Aztec emperor by the Spanish invaders. However, there is evidence of about 80,000 people being sacrificed at Templo Mayor. To the Aztecs, sacrifice was massively important. They would do them to prevent or stop famine, to celebrate special calendar events, or for many other small reasons throughout the year. To them, sacrifice was paramount to survival. The biggest reason why the Aztecs might sacrifice someone was that the sun god required sacrifices to continue its battle against darkness, and if he was to lose, the world would end, essentially believing that these sacrifices would keep the sun alive and in motion. Now that wasn't the only benefit of human sacrifice for the Aztecs though, as it could also be used as a method of intimidation. Killing war captives and having literal towers of skulls tends to freak people out. In fact, most of the people who were sacrificed at Templo Mayor were outsiders, which, yeah, if you gotta sacrifice people to keep the sun moving, you should probably use your own people only as a last resort if you're trying to survive as a community. Of course, this was far from something that only happened in the Americas, so let's jump over to the Mediterranean. Both the Greeks and Romans did practice human sacrificing to please their gods, however, it wasn't really the most common ritual. It happened very sparingly, if ever. That being said, their contemporaries, the Carthaginians, were pretty likely to make these sacrifices. Specifically, they practiced killing infants. Carthage was a very wealthy and successful region with a growing population, and most scholars on the subject seem to believe that infants were sacrificed to the gods as a method of keeping their booming populace safe and protected. That said, there was another reason on record as to why infants might be sacrificed here, as rich parents might have believed that the optimal way to keep their wealth was to give up their child. It's estimated that about 20,000 infants were sacrificed here between 800 BCE and when the Romans would conquer them in 146 CE. So at this point, we've covered the Americas, we've covered Europe, and we seem to be trending backwards in time, so let's keep this going with Asia. And one of the most famous examples would most likely come from the Shang dynasty in China, this being roughly between 1600 BCE and 1000 BCE. And here, human sacrifice was actually practiced on a pretty large scale. There seem to be about 3 categories of sacrifice here, depending on the age and gender of the sacrificed individual. A man being sacrificed would have a different purpose than a woman or a child. However, the core reason behind human sacrifice here would likely fall in line with what you might expect by now, that being to raise political power or to show religious devotion. And hey, if we're going back through time, we might as well go all the way back, looking at some of the oldest civilizations in recorded history with the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. In both of these cases, we have things being a little bit different than what they ended up being in other cultures. Most examples we've talked about so far can be related to religion or politically based decisions, and these ones are, well, they sort of do that. While Mesopotamia often had kings, Egypt had a pharaoh, and in both cases they had roles which kind of mixed the ideas of political and religious rulers. That being said, a pharaoh in Egypt might have a more religious focus than a Mesopotamian king, while a Mesopotamian king was said to rule under divine providence. Either way though, that leads us to their special type of human sacrifice, being retainer sacrifices. When the king or pharaoh died, it sometimes happened that their handmaids, soldiers, spouses, whatever else they wanted really, would be buried with them. When it came to soldiers and handmaids, they would just be executed on the spot, while in most cases the queens would just be buried alive. This was not always practiced though, and in Egypt particularly, we would see a relatively quick shift away from this as stand-ins would be used in later examples. So why are human sacrifices so commonplace in anime and media in general, especially when we're looking at fantasy or historical settings? Well, it's because it's heavily ingrained in our collective history as a species. From as far back as recorded civilization goes, we have examples of human sacrifice being used to appease the gods, to gain political power, to create a sense of intimidation, for financial gain, or even just to keep the sun in motion. It's a pretty grand gesture, and as such there was an expectation for a grand reward. But of course, these are just some quick glances at human sacrifice across a few anime series, as well as from throughout history and all over the world. Let me know if there's any other interesting cases that I missed or you think would have been cool to look into, and what you thought about this video in general. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video though, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more content in the future. Also, consider sharing this one. I don't think YouTube's going to recommend it to too many people because of, the human sacrifice element, so I would appreciate the help there. You can also ring the bell down below to ensure that YouTube actually notifies you when I post. Finally, you can check out the link in the description down below if you're looking to support the channel a bit extra with my Patreon. I want to give a big thanks to our current patrons with our Dai Yokai Iffy Babes, Ikerochu, Jacob Wiley, our Yokai, Amelia Hellman, Anel Cruz, Blood Wolfmon, Jamie Heck, Janice Not Janice, Lucifina Akuma and Joker Rose, and our Hanyo, Alexandra Gartside, Anthony Hogan, Eli Conem, Kiwi Dog, Love the Kiwi, Michael Grayco, Nega Kitty, Randy Moseyman, Samantha Olsen, Savage Camel, and Suki Neko. Thank you guys so much for watching, hope you enjoyed, and until next time, remember to stay excellent.